Welcome to Sea Views, where we float the big issues in maritime. I'm Julia Gosling and my co-host is Adam Parnell from Chirp.
Thanks, Julia. This podcast is for everybody who works in maritime as well as for everybody who has an interest in maritime.
The next episode is such an interesting topic because we're talking about neurodiversity at sea. And you can listen anywhere that you get your podcasts from, and you can watch Sea Views on the Chirp YouTube channel.
Mission vessel Great Falls Labrador Coast Guard, we are reading you out and clear.
Hello, it's Julia Gosling here from Sea Views and Adam Parnell from Chirp. Welcome, Adam.
Hello, how you doing?
Welcome, Daniel. This is Daniel Smith. You're the founder and the chair of the charity NeurodiversAtSea.
Thank you. Like I say, pleasure to be here. This is going to be an experience for all of us.
We're delighted. We're really delighted to talk to you.
It's fantastic to be here.
Yeah. And we're going to talk all about neurodiversity at sea, what it means, and find out from you because it's a really interesting topic, isn't it? So maybe you talk to me and Adam about what you're doing or what the charity is up to.
Sure. So neurodiversity is, I like to term it as a bit like a new Coke, in that it's a new term for something that's quite old. So it's essentially this biological fact that we all think and act differently because we have different brains, which means we all sort of interact with all around us a bit differently. We all process things a bit differently. We all understand different things differently. It's just called as being human beings, right? I mean, Adam will experience something differently than me, than yourself, Julia. But where things have got complicated is, whereas in the past that was just an accepted norm years and years ago, as we in society kind of developed and we have started to shoebox things a lot more, we've had to develop a phrase or a term to describe people that society deems to be a little bit, to think or interact with stuff a little bit more differently than what we used to, basically speaking, right? So in reality, neurodiversity encompasses those who are autistic, like myself, ADHDers, dyslexics, dyspraxics, dyscalculics, dysgraphics, potentially also those who have OCD and Tourette syndrome and some other bits and pieces as well, although the jury's very much out on that in the moment. Officially, it's kind of a weird grey area. So that's what the term basically means. It's a big, scary word that essentially just describes how we all think and act a bit differently.
Okay, that's really useful, I think, just to kind of get an idea of what it incorporates, because you hear terms coming out and, like you said, the new Coke analogy, which I love, and then you hear them bandied around. And you're like, well, what actually does it mean? And that's really
I was going to
helpful.
say, society does love a label, doesn't it? I mean, that's
yes.
I, as you say, everybody's individual. Everybody's on a spectrum, no matter what that spectrum is, however you define it. These labels really are just like buckets, aren't they, along that spectrum?
Exactly, yeah. It is literally like a pigeonhole. It is, you meet these things, so that is your pigeonhole. I personally don't think we should be pigeonholing. I think we should just accept people for who we are and who they are, but that is the way society wants to go, and that's the one we have to exist in. So such is the way the cookies rumble.
And I suppose, in case any of our listeners are thinking, gosh, you've just poured out a whole bunch of terms, some of which some of them are going to know. And by the way, we're not going to go through them all and define them because that would take us forever. Yeah. But sort of, I guess, at the highest of high levels, what's the so what of all these different terms?
So the so what basically is that people who think differently have different solutions to different problems. And that means that they will see things a bit differently. So let's say from a safety standpoint, instead of you having a group of people who all see the same thing the same way and the same issue, if you have what we call a diverse team of minds, like a group of people who all think differently, they all may see different safety issues and then have different solutions to those issues.
And that's amazing. I mean, to me, what you've just described there sounds like the perfect antidote to groupthink.
Exactly. That's what it is. I mean, fintech, for example, has noticed this. Normal IT, GCHQ, and sort of the cybercrime kind of things notice that as well, that when you have a diverse set of minds, you then, by default, don't have to worry about groupthink. And because you haven't got to worry about groupthink, you end up finding very peculiar ways of doing things that may not make sense to the layperson, but actually when you sit down and look at it in more detail, you go, actually, that's a lot safer, a lot quicker, a lot more efficient, a lot cheaper, a lot better. And it gives us a competitive edge in whatever environment we're in.
And I suppose without going down the stereotype route, each one of those terms, each one of those labels, each one of those buckets, however you want to define it, they will all have certain characteristics, right? Just full disclosure, I've got ADHD. And so for me, seeing patterns, I see patterns and things where there probably aren't even links, but I can still go, well, that and that just happen to correlate, even if there may not be causation, but I can see correlation in a way that lots of people can't.
Exactly. It is recognizing that, because that's a big issue you tend to have in the community, is that, when you say someone who's autistic, you immediately think, oh, Sheldon Cooper, or the guy in The Good Doctor whose name I can't remember, the surgeon who is hyper autistic, whatever it is. You immediately think that, and that's it. You have to be good at maths and STEM, and that's it. Whereas in actual fact, that's not the case at all. Everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. Just because they're autistic doesn't mean they have the same strength as everybody else. One person might be great at maths, another might be good at pattern recognition, another might be good at something else. ADHD, people go, oh, well, they have ADHD, they can't focus and concentrate. No, they absolutely can. They just have to have something that interests them to focus on it. I mean, my partner has ADHD, and she will focus on something for 10 hours if I don't interrupt her sometimes. It's getting away from that thing of it's a stereotype and this is what you have and therefore you must be this and nothing else. To say, right, well, you have this thing, that means you have unique strengths and weaknesses that are unique to you.
Sounds like we're talking about making great teams, because having a great team is not about having people who all think the same way in the team, because then you're not magnifying productivity.
Each person complements the other with a different set of strengths and weaknesses.
Or they can have amazing clashes.
Exactly,
Well, that's in any team, and in life and with humans. So I think that's across the board. I don't know if we've got the numbers in maritime, but in the general population, do you know any kind of figures of how many people we're talking about?
The estimates vary. They are normally between 1 in 6 and 1 in 5-ish.
Is that people maybe who have been diagnosed or have got some kind of diagnosis?
No, so that's the statistical analysis worldwide of taking those who have diagnoses and then those who may have but don't have, and then extrapolating it out. I think those who are diagnosed will be quite a lot lower, because there is a massive sociological and cultural divide around the world when it comes to neurodiversity. It's like in the UK, for example, in America, it's very well known. It's, almost a common thing now. Whereas the further kind of east you go, or the further south you go, that kind of falls away because it is not as openly spoken about yet, although that is starting to change slowly, which is fantastic. But it's
So actually, when you say neurodiversity, it's diverse in as much as there are a range of different perspectives, but it's not diverse as in it's not unusual. So actually, I think a lot of people, when you mention neurodiversity, think you're an outlier, think that you're actually the odd one out. Whereas actually, those figures, 1 in 5, 1 in 6, pretty mainstream, aren't you? Really, in many ways.
It's much higher numbers than, say, the number of women working.
I was going to say exactly that, 1.6, 1.8%, whatever it is. I mean,
it's horrifying, the number now. It's ridiculous. But in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I'll be completely honest, because I think while some bits of shipping do lend themselves quite well to certain characteristics that come with being neurodivergent, shipping is not as receptive to those characteristics as the individual wants them to be. So you tend to find that I think the number is not as prevalent as the background in many sectors. They're not getting in to the industry in the first place because there's a barrier in the way that the industry is put in their way for no other reason than just to be awkward, I'll be honest. Or there is then, when they get into the industry, they notice that it's not as supportive as it tries to present that it is on the outside, or it's not as welcoming, or it's not as adaptive as it should be, I think, in my opinion, and then they will leave.
Do we think that the shipping industry is any idea of numbers of people that are going into this?
For some conditions, say autism and dyslexia, you may find there is a higher prevalence in maritime than the background, potentially because of the characteristic that shipping has that are quite welcoming to those individuals, not through shipping's own initiative, just by sheer chance. Fantastic stuff for people who are autistic, for example, or engineers who are dyslexic. There's not a lot of written work behind it, or at least not as much as there used to be. But it's very hands-on, it's very practical, it's very problem-solving, and that's where they really thrive. But for other people, so ADHDers, for example, they may have a harder time working in like a deck officer role or engineer role, not because of anything that's wrong with them, just because the industry isn't as accommodating as accepting as it should be. Whereas they may equally then excel in like a victualling role or something that's more public-facing, because it's more conversational, and generally speaking, the ADHDers tend to have a better time in conversation. So you may have found that some conditions have a higher level, but if it is, it's marginal. But there's no aside from the work that we've done, there is no data anywhere that I can find or that I've seen or anyone's mentioned to me about the actual numbers in maritime.
That doesn't surprise me because Julia and I, on many of our episodes, for our regular listeners, will know that we talk about this dearth of data in so many different areas in the maritime world. And I suspect even if there was a lot of data, we possibly couldn't really trust it anyway. There's a lot of cultural barriers. There's a lot of self-centering going on. There's a lot of people who don't want to admit it to themselves. There's a lot of negative connotations around labels. So people probably wouldn't even necessarily admit it, even if they were. So you're going to get under-reporting in any case, even if there was a reporting tool, which there isn't, to report.
Absolutely.
Do you know the bottom line, though, isn't it? If you look ahead, there's going to be a recruitment crisis in getting people to work at sea. So, we want to make good teams. We want to have people that have got all different variety of skills and people throw inclusive workplaces around. But that's really what it's about, isn't it? Why wouldn't we want to make sure that as many people take that career as possible if it's right for them?
I'm going to just jump in there and say, actually, without sounding like I'm trying to be the poster boy for this, I don't think there's a better time if you are neurodiversity. And why? Because I keep saying this to people, we are not suffering one, but several revolutions all at the same time in maritime. You've got novel fuels, all these new things coming out. So if you're somebody that needs a dopamine hit like I do, how more exciting does it get than we're completely reinventing the entire propulsion system of our vessels? If you want to be somebody who loves maths and you're STEM oriented and you're one of those characteristics, we're talking about AI and we're talking about autonomous vessels so all the things. I mean, the amount of engineering challenge, the amount of new things, novel things, interesting things that are coming out that nobody is. I mean, we're even struggling with lithium-ion batteries, for God's sake, and they're not particularly high tech. They've been around for a while, and yet it takes completely different procedures to look after, store. Now we're talking about that on speed, right? Because we're talking about the entire propulsion chain. We're talking about new ways of working. We're talking about ships that may or may not even have people on them, remotely operated. The skill sets we're going to need.
So I'd agree with that with one caveat. I think it's a great time to get into it from a shoreside perspective, but I don't think it's a great time to get into it from a seagoing perspective.
Okay, so let's dig into that, Daniel, because that's something we want to talk about. What do you see are the barriers for people with neurodivergence at the moment?
The barriers when it comes to going to sea are many. A lot of it is regulatory because we are dealing with a very outdated regulatory background at the moment that has not caught up and kept pace with reality. The way in which we look at medicals, for example, how the seafarer medical has transitioned from being about safety to being used more as an occupational health screening tool, but behind the scenes. For example, that's one major issue. You have ships being built to increasingly tighter budgets. So we are facing a degradation in standards and accommodation. And that means that because of that, there's less scope for companies to then make changes and provide ships that are, I guess, comfortable for everybody, not just neurodivergent seafarers, but seafarers in general. We are still tackling the issues of social security through single voyage contracts, which are a wonderful tool for ship owners, but are absolutely awful for everybody else. Because it means that when a seafarer stands up to say, hey, look, I'm neurodivergent, I'd like some adjustments, please, or, can we talk about making things a bit easier for me at work so I can be even better and perform even more than I already am, they tend to find their contract is not renewed for just no reason. I've been victim to that myself in the past. You have a lack of knowledge with amongst HR and crewing, and it tends to be a lack of sympathy because, again, it's driven by the lowest possible cost we can get. And 9 times out of 10, adjustments are seen as, or adaptations are seen as a cost.
Okay. Are some of these adjustments relatively easy to do? I mean...
That's the thing. Yeah, absolutely. 90% of them you can implement without any cost at all. And the other 10% you can implement with barely any cost and have benefits to everybody, not just the individual you're making the adjustment to.
So let's flip that narrative. Let's flip it around then. So you're right. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. The employment landscape for people who are neurodiverse can be quite a scary place. But if you're an employer and you're using difference as a reason to weed people out, actually, I think, you've missed a trick. But let's flip it around. Let's say, actually, what are the benefits of employing somebody who's neurodivergent?
The benefits are far and wide. Whether it's a case of you have someone on board who has a high attention to detail, which means they may notice things others won't. So that thing that would cost you, 20 grand, 100 grand, £1 million plus an insurance claim all of a sudden doesn't exist because someone's gone, ooh, that's a bit different, and flagged it ahead of time. You may find that you will have people who are more willing to speak out about safety issues and are more willing to stop the job than traditional individuals may do, which again saves you a cost, saves you insurance, saves you downtime, saves you all this other stuff, LTIs and what have you, keeps that lower. So then you can then go to the industry and say, well, I have a safer ship. Here's my evidence of that. Pay me a bit more for my charter rate, for example, or your P&I club. I have a safe ship, safe company. Haven't had a claim really in the past couple of months. Can we talk about our premiums? Can we try and lower things down a little bit? It may be that you have people who, because they're dyslexic and they're very practical, they may see some of the engine and go, actually, you want to do this, which means it's going to take me, 2 days to do this thing. But if I do it this way and this way and this way, I can do it in half the time at a third of the cost and still solve the issue. The benefits are far and wide. The challenge is that we don't seem to recognize that and we don't seem to see that because we are so accustomed now to having our crew effectively under our thumbs to an extent in that, we want them to just toe the line at all times and that's it. And so we are sort of shooting ourselves in the foot with that approach, that we are preventing ourselves from recognizing and realizing all these massive benefits that would otherwise make the industry better for everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, case in point, a friend of mine is autistic, walked on board a ship, looked at the SMS, and went, oh, that's a bit different. Put a recommendation in. Someone in the office went, actually, I hadn't seen that. And that recommendation has now gone fleet-wide across 100 and something ships. One simple recommendation, change of policy that no one else had seen. This person looked at it and went, that's an okay way of doing it, but actually, if we do it this way, we haven't got to expose people to this risk. We haven't got to expose them to that risk or the other risk. We haven't got to have this on board now, so it's cheaper as well.
I think you also already just picked up on that issue of reporting and being willing to report and the stop work. How can we sort of foster that more?
Because if you have a diverse team where everybody starts to feel welcomed and included and part of the conversation, all of a sudden you have this thing where standing up and speaking out against authority is seen as a bad thing because you are speaking up against an authoritarian leader or commander. To actually me saying, hey, look, have you thought about doing this? That's not going to come back on me as negative now. That's me contributing to this team, being part of the team. And I know that when I do that, it's safe for me to do that because I feel psychologically safe to stand up and do that because I feel part of this team.
And you just hit the nail right on the head. I mean, that's the very reason why even CHIRP exists. Psychological safety, or the lack thereof. What can we do about it? Grow, cultivate that psychological safety.
So again, it comes down to diverse teams. It comes down to recognizing there are unique strengths and weaknesses everybody has, and that we need to build those into our teams. We need to move away from the traditional way in which we have thought about leadership, for example, where, the captain is master under God, and that's just the way it is, and they can't be challenged, to the master is part of the team. The team is diverse. It comes from a range of backgrounds, with a range of different thoughts and opinions, and it is safe for them to speak up against that. And part of that then comes to the company, because when the company starts to push an inclusive environment and develop inclusivity on board and in the office, because people feel like, oh, well, I can speak up and be myself now. I can be me, and I can be me without risk of reprisal or fear of reprisal. That means that because you then feel like safer there, you have more confidence then to go and say, can we speak about this? Or that's not very safe, or can we stop this, take a step back?
And that should be the same for everybody. And we talked about toxic leadership on one of our other podcasts, and you make such a good point, Daniel, about the leadership and that relationship. Is it healthy or is it toxic?
I think one of the biggest drawbacks to all of this, ironically, is the word diversity. We won't get political. We're not a political organisation, but we do see, people will champion it depending on which side of this political spectrum they're on. But the point here is that we seem to have looked at mental diversity and this difference of perspective as an issue in the way that we don't look at multicultural, multinational, multiglottal crews as an issue. I mean, we did back in the bad days, but now we've gone, hey, it's good that we have people from different cultures, different perspectives. So in many ways, people that are neurodiverse, they may be speaking the same language to you, but if they're using it in a slightly different way, they're doing nothing more than speaking a different language. But actually, you're already on a ship that might have 15 different languages being spoken anyway.
Yeah, I personally don't like the word diversity. I think it's far too problematic. because it doesn't actually deal with the problem that we have. I far prefer to use the word inclusivity. We shouldn't be fostering diverse teams. We should be fostering inclusive teams. We shouldn't be creating diverse work environments. We should be creating inclusive work environments. Because all of a sudden, when you start dealing with inclusivity and you start making places that are inclusive, they by default become diverse. So instead of you chasing a number like, let's say we must have a 50-50 gender split, for example, right? And I use that because it's the most widely known thing in maritime. Instead of chasing that number, why don't we start chasing, well, how many barriers exist towards women getting into shipping and staying into shipping? Why is shipping not inclusive to those individuals? Right. Let's target removing X many barriers by Y date. And the more barriers you get rid of, the more people come into shipping, the more people stay in shipping. And it's by sheer fact of trickle down, you end up with that 50-50 split. But now it's not, you remove that thing where it becomes a PNG of, the most hated hot button topic on the planet, and where you end up with going on ships where people say, oh, well, you're just here because you're checking a box. You do away with that because you're not chasing a number.
Well, if anybody ever turned around to me and said, oh, you only did what you did in the Navy because you ticked a box. Well, here's the kicker. I didn't find out until 3 years ago that I even had ADHD. So go square that one. I'd spent 26 years in the Navy doing me, being me, without a label. Nobody recruited me because, I ticked a box. Nobody gave me the chances I had because I ticked a box, because I didn't even know that box existed, let alone ticked it. Now, I happen to think personally that most of the people I've met who go to sea are probably on the spectrum somewhere anyway, because I think it takes a certain type of person who goes, no, I'll willingly give up my friends, my family, my social life. Great, and you'll wake me up in the middle of the night and give me god-awful food for months at a time. So you've got to be somewhere on that spectrum anyway. But, and I know that both of you have quite strong political views on this, so let's, I think we should keep those to one side, but acknowledge that it is nevertheless a significant barrier to recruitment, recruitment and retention.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that, like you say, it has become politicized, and I don't think it has any right to be politicized.
No.
Because ultimately you're talking about human beings.
Exactly.
And that is the thing that we have to remember here, that ultimately when we talk about let's get more women at sea, or let's have more neurodivergent individuals into maritime, or LGBTQI plus, whatever else, we're just talking about human beings. Yeah. That's it. When someone comes to you and says, can we have a chat about my last contract, about the conditions on board or the food on board, as an example you've used, how the food's really not great and I'm really struggling with it and whatever else. Ultimately, it's a human being going to one and saying, look, can we have a chat? I'd like some help, some support. That's not a bad thing. We shouldn't see it as a bad thing, but we do, because the way the maritime works, unfortunately.
And once you work with someone who, tells you they have this label or whatever, and they become your friend, or you have a friend that then it's not just that label that you've heard. And like you're saying, it's a human thing, but just that's the problem with some labels, isn't it? That it can be depersonalized, dehumanized,
more damaging than they do good. Now, I'm not going to take that away from anybody who wishes to stand behind a label and identify it. I mean, I identify being autistic, for example. I mean, I am diagnosed, whatever else, but to me, that is a label that's part of me. That will never change. So I do completely get why people stand behind labels, but I also get why they can be damaging as well. And it's why we try and advocate for the approach of, look, there's a human being, learn about what they've told you, learn about the conditions that they may have, sit down, talk to them, help them, work together, solve the problem, away you go. Simple.
There's obviously some structural issues with the industry. We know that, and they're big issues, like how people are employed. Those are things that many people have wanted to tackle, and it's a big job. But what's coming up? What kind of things are you doing in the future, or that you got planned to kind of try and push some of these barriers out of the way?
A lot of what we're doing at the moment is focused on how to get the message out there that these people exist. There's no point in us going to market and selling something if there's not a market there for it in the first place. So a lot of it is awareness. A lot of it is to say, look, these people exist. You're not alone out there. There are people like you who suffer the same as you, have the same battles as you. You are not going through it alone. There are people there who support you, who champion you, who stand behind you, who stand beside you. So a lot of it is outreach, it's awareness.
And that probably really supports the people who are perhaps struggling a bit at the moment. That's very, very powerful for them.
Yeah, we do have to be somewhat careful as to how we do that, because it becomes a safeguarding issue, and mostly saying to people, look, you are not alone. I mean, I said at a recent conference, as a closing remark I made, it was, yes, we're getting hammered from every angle. but you are not alone in this fight. Don't speak alone, because you are not alone. Speak together, because the more people that stand up and shout and make a noise, the more we have to listen. That's the bulk of the work we're doing. In the near to long-term futures, we also have some things launching that I can't really talk about, but that's why we're taking on more volunteers. If anybody wants to volunteer with us, please feel free to do so.
I'll put the links in the show notes so people can follow that.
Wonderful stuff.
Okay, so you want to make awareness, but you also want to work with industry and get those voices heard more strongly.
It's trying to walk a very fine line that is very difficult to walk between serving the industry and also the individual at the same time, because the two don't tend to go hand in hand. Because it's very difficult for you to be, the industry likes positivity. It likes you to say that how fantastic things are from a DEI standpoint, how amazing we're all doing and how welcoming we are. And then you're like, well, actually, are we? Are you sure about that?
What about working with unions?
James Stockbridge, one of our trustees, was very involved with Nautilus. We do a lot of work with P&I clubs from a loss management standpoint, particularly on mental health conditions, because it's recognised that neurodivergent individuals tend to have poor mental health than average because of the environment. So a lot of work there. We are trying to do some research as well in the future. We've got a grant scheme that we launched recently to enable neurodivergent seafarers to access a full diagnosis in the UK, so that they can then get help and support through oral exams and through written exams and what have you that they may not otherwise have access to.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was your advocacy role. So you've said that, you can signpost people to support. So is that a support service you offer yourselves, or is that you?
No, we pass through to others. Because of how small we are and because of the legal complications that come with that, becomes having to have paid staff to do that and having to have a whole policy and procedure in place and specific training for it and management tools and systems in place. It's a difficult thing to comply with. I wouldn't feel confident and comfortable doing it without being fully compliant. So what we do is we have some organisations that we work behind the scenes, and we'll pass any concerns on we have to them if we feel that there is that need to do so. Although thankfully, knock on wood, that has not happened yet. Because the other thing we try and do is we will work with other organisations like Safer Waves, for example, to supplement their service by giving them some neurodiversity awareness training, for example, to their volunteers who are on the front line, so they have a bit more knowledge, so that if someone comes to them directly, they are still benefiting from the advocacy work that we've done, but without our direct involvement.
So I love to split the seafaring world into three very, very broad slices, if like a Victoria sponge cake. So the seafarers, we're talking about the seafarers to start with then. So you can offer a pass-through service and signpost people to sources of support. So if we're talking, the next layer up would be like the owners, the managers, the sort of senior people in a company. What could you offer them, or guidance or other sources?
It is just advice, it's guidance, we will look at your policies, procedures, make sure they're all how they should be. We will help you form DEI working groups, for example, is something we're doing recently with a ship owner. We will look at how you recruit, how you retain. We will look at the conditions you have on board. We'll come in and talk to you. We'll come in and train you, which we don't charge for.
Free is always a nice number for people to listen to.
Exactly. If it's a big company, then we'll ask for expenses just to travel to and back if it's something you want to do in person. But aside from that, no, we tend to do it for free, because the viewpoint that we tend to have with this is that it's far more important to bring about the change than it is for me to make a book out of this. So
that's interesting. And what about like the third layer? And you might not be able to answer this one, so do tell me if it's an unfair question. What about more at the regulatory level?
We've done some work with some maritime regulatory bodies to look at how they examine candidates and the examination process they use, the support mechanisms they have in place, whether that's sufficient or not. They weren't, but they've now changed them, so they now are. We're involved with some stuff to do with mass, so with autonomy, to make sure that when that develops, if we can get something in the code to make it a bit more inclusive and a bit more mandate accessibility standards, then we're looking at that. One of the projects I want to do personally is look at the bridge recruitment we have on board and see, is it actually user-friendly or not? And if it's not, how do we make it user-friendly? Because I have been on bridges where some stuff has been wonderful, and I have used other manufacturers' equipment who I will not name, and it has been absolutely horrendous. So that's something we want to try and do in the future, but that involves having to have contacts and
it takes time.
Those sound quite technical in nature. What about the more softer stuff? So to give you an example, and I was saying this to Julie before the show, I, for a while, was being titrated with ADHD medication on the basis that to see if it was going to work or not. And it turned out I didn't really need it. But much to my surprise, it turned out that what I was getting given was micro doses of basically Class A drugs, which you can imagine would go down like a bomb, right? If I go to certain parts of the world with a pack of these in my pocket. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because if you're a seafarer, by default, when you're on a ship, you don't really have a lot of say on where it goes. But you could easily find yourself in hot water, potentially, legally at least, if you were trying to get some more medication because you run out.
And that's unfortunately one that we do want to tackle because we recognise it's a major barrier. The challenge is that to tackle it realistically will require IMO level involvement. And for anybody who knows how the IMO works, the amount of paperwork and meetings and bargaining required to change a comma from before a word the to after the word the is insane. So trying to bring about change or something like that, on medication at an international level will be a long process.
It's long-term intervention, isn't it? Daniel, what about individuals in maritime now who are seeking some kind of diagnosis? Is there anything you can do to help?
So we have a grant scheme that we just launched. That launched last month. So there's a pot of money. It's just shy of £10,000 that's been made available to seafarers in the UK who suspect they're neurodivergent to work in the maritime, merchant navy, or I think fishers as well. May also be allowed to partake
commercial fishers,
Yeah, commercial fishers. I know merchant navy is a tick, and I don't remember asking for fishers to be excluded. I may even ask for them to be included specifically, so I'll double check what the MOU says, just to be certain. So that's available now. That's mentioned as the Seafarers Hospital Society, the SCH, the SHS. There's an email on the website, ping an email to it, say, look, I may have X, Y, or Z. I'd like to get a formal diagnosis. I can't afford it because whatever. Can you help? And they have a pot of money there that they can then draw from. Thanks to Seafarers UK, Seafarers Charity in the UK. Just check them out as well. They're funding it. How gracious of them, sort of thing. But and it's designed to help those who are going through examination process for COC so they can unlock and access specific support to gain that COC in their exams that they may not otherwise have access to.
Oh, that's great. That's really good news. That's sort of something directly that you can help people with right now. So I will make sure I mention that in the notes if anybody wants to find out more about that. You've got one final question, Daniel. If you could change anything to sort of improve maritime safety in this world, what do you think you might do?
I would create a more inclusive maritime industry for the reasons that I alluded to before, that when you have an inclusive industry, you feel safe, you feel psychologically safe, therefore you feel able to speak out, to stop the job, to say, look, this isn't right, it's not safe, I don't feel comfortable.
It would change the atmosphere, wouldn't it?
Dramatically.
And Adam would get a lot more reports.
Hey, you know what? That's what we're here for. Feed me reports.
Yeah, because lots of reports doesn't always mean a bad ship, does it?
Inevitably, we find that the more reports we get actually shows a better culture than a worse one.
I think you've got a good mission there, and we'll probably have to talk to you again, I think, because you've got some stuff that's short-term and you've got some real long-term ambitions as well.
I usually go, pie in the sky, look at this all this amazing stuff I want to do and go, that's going to take more time than I'm going to be on this planet to achieve. But there we go. We'll do what we can.
But, it's been such an interesting conversation. And this is something that's so important for maritime now and also for the future, if we look at the recruitment into maritime. So really interesting to see what you're doing. So we're going to ring the bell now and we're going to leave the bridge very, very carefully and safely.
Vessel Great Northern Labrador Coast Guard, we are reading you out and clear.